In a previous session, we discussed a 2x4 model that explains the reasons why sport organizations, more often than not, fail to implement standards and principles of good governance. Against these four logics, there are 6 different mechanisms which, when applied, ensure a greater degree of compliance in and around good governance implementation. Essentially, each of these mechanisms responds to one or more of the 4 previously mentioned logics of non-compliance. My goal in this session, therefore, is to remind you of these mechanisms because we all know them well, thereby offering you some broad ways of how you can, to various degrees of explicitness, utilize them to overcome the non-compliance logics. First, for those who voluntarily choose not to comply, control, measurement that is, and subsequently sanctions are the most appropriate compliance mechanism. The measurement, as shown by the data captured by the Sports Governance Observatory of National Federations program, mobilizes and causes changes in organizational behaviors because it reduces the possibility that some non-compliance behaviors will go unnoticed. Sanctions then take the form of various measures that have costs, including financial consequences or exclusion from other benefits. These measures are not necessarily about legal enforcement. Reputational costs associated with name tarnishing, for example, can also exert coercive pressure. However, to induce compliance, the sanctioning process should be credible and the cost imposed should be greater than the benefit of non-compliance. Let me use an example to make the point. Imagine that one drives a luxury superfast car and the police stop the driver for exceeding, by far, the speed limit. If the penalty is a few $100s, then this driver will continue driving the same way as before simply because the cost imposed to him or to her was insignificant for changing the driving behavior. The next mechanism of compliance concerns persuasion through effort and argumentation as to the correctness, legality, but above all, the effectiveness of specific regulatory provisions related to the improvement of governance within sport organizations. For example, non-compliance with board renewal in the name of existing experience and influence in decision-making centers does not ensure sustainability, but quite the opposite. It undermines it and puts the organization in doubt in the long term. The next 3 mechanisms are more related to involuntary non-compliance related logics. In other words, they refer to cases where there is the willingness but not the ability to comply. Therefore, to avoid non-compliance resulting from failures in the practical application of often nebulous principles of good governance, the compliance system must provide for both the valid specification of the rules and the clear definition of their implementation obligations. A validation body need not formalize such a mechanism, but may be informal and non-binding. The organization, the system therefore, that supervises the degree of compliance may designate an employee who will provide clarifying information throughout the implementation of the principles of good governance. Let us not forget that compliance is not an end in itself, but a never-ending effort towards better governance. In addition, since in most cases sport organizations do not have the financial, administrative, and technical capacity to comply, they are often hampered in their own compliance actions. In such cases, an appropriate problem-solving strategy is to involve the supervisory body in capacity building through outsourcing expertise and resources. The last mechanism concerns what we call social learning, which is based on training seminars for exchanging knowledge and good practices within the country and internationally. This course, in fact, is an illustrative example of these mechanisms, since its content has been designed to help you all better understand the implementation of standards and principles of good governance. Okay, now we know that 4 logics justify why sport organizations fail to comply with standards and principles of good governance. We also know the 6 mechanisms we can employ to deal with these non-compliance logics.